Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of Say Again with me, your host, Amrita Tripathi. So, today's episode is special for many reasons. It's either going to go really well because I know our guest, Abhishek Kumar, so well, or we're going to see if we need to edit out and do some sort of work in post production. Abhishek Kumar, thank you so much for joining Say Again, a podcast you've been involved with right from the very start.
Great to be on it finally.
So I will do a short introduction for you, Abhishek. As some of our viewers and listeners know, you are a former group CEO of Balaji Telefilms. Abhishek's also been an expert on M&A, negotiation, having closed deals worth $700 million in the past several years. You're a huge advocate of the Indian startup story, but you got your start in the media. So I do want to talk to you a little bit about your own career trajectory, Abhishek, but also a little bit about the macro climate we find ourselves in right now in 2025. Let me kick off by asking you, how are you looking at the market, the economy right now? The headlines are just one way, one day, another way, the other. How are you looking at the startup ecosystem and climate right now?
Yeah, I think everyone's right now waiting for things to settle from the US in terms of we hear every day about tariffs, about changes in immigration laws, which affect a lot of Indian companies. Right, so that has to still settle. So we are in the midst of that. I think there are as we've read in the papers and as some of our ministers have said, they are in negotiations for trade deals with the US. So I think that because of the outsized influence that America has in, I guess, most economies across the world, most large economies, even China for that matter, right? China-US trade ties are very important for China's domestic economy also. Not maybe in larger economies like India and China, it's not as big a deal. But when it comes to a large number of Indian companies which are export dependent, especially our IT companies, it makes a lot of difference. The whole controversy around H1B, for example, almost entirely affected Indians and Indian companies more than any other economy or country across the world. So for that reason, I think in terms of macro views, as you know, the Indian markets have been correcting I think now for 5-6 months. There was talk that after the budget things would settle, but then that was overtaken by the trade talks with the US. We're finishing the first quarter of this calendar year, but I don't think there's any clarity on these issues yet. And we'll have to wait to see what happens. That said, domestically also, I think consumption is a worry. I think everyone's been saying that. It's very evident now. I think that will start having an impact also. Overall, for the markets, I think it's time to be careful. If you talk of the public markets, I think valuations are pretty reasonable, or at least reasonable compared to what they were a year ago or 6 months ago. Whether that is still the realistic valuation of a lot of companies, we can't say, but there are buying opportunities. I speak to a lot of people who are very active in the markets or who have been for a very long time. I think you can easily have two segments of investors these days. I think amongst the retail investors, one are the ones who've been in the markets for a while, for at least a decade or so. So they've seen corrections earlier. And then there are those who came in maybe after COVID, who have only seen the post 2021 rise, and uh, what they thought were corrections were not really corrections. What we are having today, a 20% drop in the index, is sort of a correction, right? So I think those who've been here for a while, they see opportunity. Right? But I'm not an expert in the stock markets. I can only talk about my experience as a retail investor, and not a very large investor directly in markets. It's mostly through mutual funds. So I
Yeah.
think it's a great time to be in the markets carefully if you have extra capital, but not to go crazy on any one cue today.
And in some ways, what you've also been indicating, what we're seeing in the headlines, waiting for the dust to settle, at some level with some of the macro economic, but the geopolitics as well. You brought up China, and I think it's really interesting because I know you're someone who watches a lot of the trends. You've been to China several times, on work trips as well. When they came out with DeepSeek, I think that was this big moment where, collectively the world was kind of like gasping to be like, this is a huge moment, especially when you look at Gen AI, you look at China's progress and prowess. Of course, India and China have its own sort of friction in the relationship. But, in terms of a business point of view, or when you look at the ecosystem yourself, what are you looking at from China at this point? What's going to be interesting to watch out for this year?
See, on DeepSeek first, I think I was very excited by the fact that, see, since 2022 that's when I think ChatGPT came out, the first version, public version. And since then, we've been told that this can only be done by large companies based in large economies with access to insane amounts of power, electricity, right? And we've all heard the investments that Amazon and Google have been making in companies that are developing SMRs, or a nuclear power and captive nuclear power. And because they believe that you can only do this with thousands, hundreds of thousands of GPUs, especially NVIDIA GPUs, which are American owned. And most of the world, I think, for a while gave up on models and was resigned to the idea of being consumers of one of these large models based in the United States because of multiple reasons. Of course, as I said, access to large uninterrupted electricity, capital in the tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars, which was required. So most countries were resigned to the fact that you have to be now either you can be agentic, you can have wrappers, but the models are out of reach. Now, what DeepSeek proved that you can probably do the same work or reach the same level of sophistication in a model with maybe less than half the number of GPUs, and not necessarily the same expensive GPUs, on which late last year there was a cap put on exports, so you couldn't even buy those GPUs which you needed for making or running these LLMs. So I think what DeepSeek did, and probably that was a big favor to the rest of the world, was to show that you can do maybe the same level of or achieve the same level in of compute without needing thousands of very expensive GPUs and hundreds of billions of dollars of investment. It's still expensive, but it is not out of reach now for most of the major countries in the world now. I think it's not, if China can, or if DeepSeek proved. In fact, after DeepSeek, there was a couple of other models also put out by Alibaba, etc. So
Yeah.
I think that democratization of the models is one huge development that happened end of last year. That said, I think, of course, the US still has a huge advantage. US and China, I would say. So both of them now are at par in terms of
everyone is seeing this as a
AI.
US versus China kind of race.
Yeah. So it is multipolar in that sense, at least, and if not any other. But I think that's one big development, and that should be a signal to. See, I'm not privy to what India is doing on the model side, or if anyone has built or is building anything on that side, because as I said, it still requires some billions of dollars, like maybe not tens, but a few billions of dollars to be invested in before any real output can be tested, right? So, but it can be done, and that's what I think DeepSeek proved. That changed the whole paradigm. You saw, the huge correction in the US markets of all the stocks related, both of Nvidia as well as other stocks related to any way touching AI, because they had been driven up on the promise that they're the only ones who can do this, right? And DeepSeek really corrected that market. So I think that's good. On India and China, I mean, see, I have been, when the first time I went to China was 2015, and to all these places, Shanghai, Shenzhen, Beijing, and of course, it was very clear that to anyone who traveled to China or who met with Chinese professionals, that I think what people are realizing today in the West, which is the sophistication of Chinese business and Chinese the economy, was very clear even 10 years ago. It was just maybe not as public. Maybe there was no TikTok, and maybe there wasn't that much. Even today, you can't access, I mean, much of social media in China, but or global media in China. But I think it was a good eye-opening experience traveling there, meeting them, their dedication to work, their passion to a mission, whether it's for the company, for the country, whatever it is. They are very, very focused, and I mean, we are neighbors, right? We are as much neighbors as we are with the other countries around us, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Bangladesh. We have, there are issues, there are political disputes, there are border disputes, whatever, very public. But I remember
Security and privacy also, no?
yeah, security and privacy. And I think, even in the times that I remember in 2017, 16 or 17, when again there were some border skirmishes, not as bad as now, not as bad as 2020, but before that there were some border issues, some violence at the border. And that calendar year, China was still the number one FDI investor into India. And so I think business to business relations between India and China have been very good for the last 20 years. Of course, I mean, we might be in a deficit, we import more, but that's on us. We have to scale up. I think there is a level of mistrust on both sides. I think that is not going away easily. For us, I think we should learn a lot from there. Maybe what we are focusing today on manufacturing, right? I think we are doing very well on that in some sectors at least. And I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned from the Chinese. I think that's how I look at it. I don't think it's a time to be jingoistic about China or any other country in the neighborhood. I think what is proven now across the world with what's happening is that you have to have, I mean, bilateral relations are very important. You need to, of course, politically and strategically, you have to safeguard the interests of the country. But I think economy can play a great massager in any talks, right? Because trade by definition is a gain for both sides, right? So I think, I think in terms of China, we should step back from being very antagonistic at times. Of course, our national interests come first. They should never be compromised. But we have to learn. We have to learn a lot because that's how they built up, right? So they learned a lot
let
from
me
American
ask you,
manufacturing.
sort of based on that, Abhishek, let me ask you a little bit, because, we've been seeing a lot of these debates. So obviously some debates make it to the media headlines insofar as people are still consuming mass media or legacy media. But where do you stand on this? And, from your track record of sort of, your former group CEO, you're a former CEO, you've been in leadership positions for more than 20 years. Across the media and entertainment industries, as well as in finance. Where do you stand on all of these statements on, 60, 70, 80-hour work weeks versus work-life balance versus exploitation? I know that, in some circles, people are just like, let's just get on with it. But what is your take?
I think the whole idea of discussing number of hours of working a certain number of hours is it's quite reductive an argument, because as we all know, people, we as managers, we have all hired and run teams across scales, right? Small teams, large teams, and small and large organizations. And we know that, see, unless you're on the factory floor where metrics are defined by number of hours output per number of hour or whatever, depending on the industry. I think in the non-manufacturing space, at least, it's the output in the end matters. There are deadlines. See, the number of hours, there are two arguments. One is the work from home versus working in office, and the other, which is I think more prevalent now in India, is the number of hours you work. I really don't think it matters if someone's working 70 hours or 50 hours or 40 hours, because and this, I know this, I would always prefer someone who delivers to me on time the assigned objectives, the work, whatever it is, the project, in an acceptable manner, and it ships, and rather than preferring someone who's in the office 12 to 14 hours a day. So I really don't buy this argument of you should work, because if you're happy with somebody being in office 70 hours, if that's all that you're judging that employee on, or colleague on, then that says a lot about your business, right? Because then you're in a business where only having a body in a seat matters. Fine. Then I guess hours matter. But as I said, in any other variety or any other nature of output, whether it's creative, whether it's software, whether it's writing code, we all know. I mean, somebody writing code maybe would work like 30 hours straight and then take 4 days off. It doesn't matter, because the code matters. The quality of the code matters. It matters if the team is able to ship in time.
Yeah.
The number of hours per day, I think, as I said earlier, is a reductive argument. It's a very old-fashioned way of thinking, right? Because what are you basing that on? Right? What are those hours producing for you? That matters. If those hours include
So
like 2 hours,
quality,
3 hours
over.
of lunch breaks and smoke breaks and chai breaks, then even 70 is not enough.
Yeah, that's true.
You mentioned, I mean, we discussed China first. I never saw this in China. It was never an issue. They were never worried about people. First, people were very motivated to do what they were doing because that was a time in China when they were actually becoming a developed economy. I'm talking about 10 years ago and even later. And of course, now it's very evident that they are a developed economy. They are uh, number two today or number one, whatever it is. But they were focused on the mission. I never heard anyone talking about number of hours of working, or of course this is pre work from home culture, so everyone was in office, but it was never about oh, I need my people to work this many hours. I mean, in factories, yeah, they had shifts, and again, if you have shifts, you have shifts. You can't expect them to do extra shifts every day, right? They won't do that. I mean, it doesn't work like that. So and I
Yeah.
also feel that if you overwork people, quality suffers. Um, if you're not worried about quality, I wouldn't know where you would not be worried about quality. But I was quite surprised to hear some very senior people say that. But they must have their reasons. I don't know. I'm
Yeah,
not sure.
I have a feeling they're reacting to maybe factors we're not aware of, perhaps, because it's just been
Yeah,
going on for so long, and people saying that, now that probably trying to get away from this debate, saying, like you said, you need to be looking at building. And if this economy is going to transform, we're going to need to change a lot of things. But yeah, I'm
yeah.
glad to
And
hear.
with AI, it really won't matter, right?
Yeah,
Everything is going to change. The number
yeah,
of people you have, the number of hours they work, how they work, everything
yeah,
will change in every. I think that's what people don't understand. I think they look at AI as a disruption in tech or tech-based industries. I think the disruption will be much greater
yeah,
in the non. Of course, it's already disrupted software, right? Coding,
yeah.
it has. But I think the disruption that's coming for the other sectors will be even more transformative, and I think that's where we will have to see whether, because we've had a very protectionist economy for many decades. I think that will probably not be helpful to us then,
Hmm.
because then the whole paradigm will shift. Everything will change now.
So, let me just take a step back and ask you a few questions now from the point of view of, your involvement or your interest in the startup ecosystem, including, as a funder in the past, like you've worked with VCs, you've been around a lot of VCs. There's a little bit of that. I don't know if that sheen is worn off or not, but that could be just subjective. So some of my listeners and viewers, as you know, we're trying our own startup journey. And one of the things we were learning, of course, is that 90% to 95% of startups fail. That's been a lesson that has been brought home to me. Abhishek has shared that with me. So is Mukesh Bansal on a panel in his new book on the startup code. The other thing was we were told to just use whatever unfair advantages you can, right? So that means flexing where you can, use your network. So Abhishek, you've been advising me and many other more successful entrepreneurs, of course. What are some of the mistakes you see, common mistakes for startup founders? Because at one point, and I do think it's partly this cool sort of, there was this kind of shine, right? Everyone wanted to be an entrepreneur. Like, I think watching Shark Tank or listening to the success stories, and I'm talking about, like, the few years leading up to last year, and all of a sudden that kind of shine and sheen wore off a little bit. But what are some common mistakes you've seen with startups? And we'll get some advice from you also on what you think startup founders should focus on, because it's not just about the idea, like you've told me. It's not just about having that cool idea. So common mistakes first.
I think now, these days, if you open Twitter or maybe even LinkedIn, you have so much gyan on startups that I think I don't even need to say anything because everyone can just read. Everyone's giving gyan on startups. But the mistakes, or I would say, I think the difference between, you mentioned the failures and the successes. The one thing I saw, and I worked with very successful startup founders who built multi-billion-dollar businesses and very well-known names. And I think, at least in the initial phase, the successful ones stood out because they were the ones building for their users, buyers, consumers, whatever you call them. versus many others who were building to raise funding. So there were a lot who would just focus on building a startup or a business which would look attractive for a VC to invest in. Whereas the really successful ones were the ones who built first to attract users. I know most people will say, but that, they're both the same, right? If you have users, you'll get VCs, but it doesn't work like that. I think I've seen a lot of people first focus on making sure that they have the right deck that will attract a VC, etc., etc. Rather than, it's tougher, but I would say build out first, get real users or buyers or consumers, have them validate the business, and then you don't need to validate to an investor, right? Validation for a business should not come from an investor only. It has to first come from the user. Yes, maybe at an idea stage, if you're getting kind of angel investors, seed investors, yeah, fine. You discuss with them, they believe in your idea, they will give you that capital to start out. But then after that, you have to have enough critical mass of users, which depends on the sector. Obviously, in some sectors a few hundred users might be good enough to proceed. In some you need thousands, right? And I think if you parse out all the successful startups in the last 10 years, you look at them, they would have raised capital, their first institutional round of capital, much longer or further down in their journey than the unsuccessful ones. We all know the very large startups which raised a large amount of money and then crashed and burned, right? Because when it was time to get the consumers buy-in or the users buy-in, that's where they stumbled, right? They all had shiny decks, PPTs, but I don't think that works. I think so. Yeah, I think focus on the user, consumer. I think that's all, and that's not even an advice. That everyone knows that. Maybe also just stay away from all the startup media for a while, because there's so much noise. You have to zone in on your business, your users, your competitors, and that's it. And for a while, just stay on that. There will be always noise about some other competitors coming, doing something, raising something. I think raising capital became the end for a lot of people. Part of the reason for this is also that the media celebrated a capital raise more than a successful business again and again over the last maybe say 15 years, right? And I've seen this firsthand, and I was in a company, a startup which raised I don't know, $1.8 billion, and that the raise itself was the news and the celebration. They should have focused on the business, on what's happening, right? How's the business growing? How are the people working there? What are they saying? But that never happened. I don't think it still happens. I think it's also because there's a huge gap between the people who cover this segment of startups and the startups themselves. First of all, clubbing everything into a category called startups for one page of a newspaper is anyway a mistake, right? A healthcare startup is in no way related and can no way be compared to a consumer tech startup or a grocery startup, right? But they are on the same page of the newspaper. So the people covering them are the same. Now you can't be, because either you are an expert in technology, or you're an expert in medicine, or you're an expert in retail. I don't know, but it has to be something, right? That's how founders work. But that's not how people who are experts, so called, on this, and even those who cover it. Long story short, I think just don't focus on the noise, or try very hard to actually keep the noise out, and just focus on your business, your users, your consumers. That's it. As all VCs work, they're always on the lookout for successful startups. They will reach out. Frankly, if you're successful, you don't even need to go and pitch. You will have capital coming in at the right time, because you will make the right amount of noise, or you will do that yourself through your success. And it's true of all successful startups. I mean, globally, not even just India.
Interesting. And I think, part of it is also it's so new, right? Like entrepreneurship as a category, perhaps. I think for a lot of Indians, it is, there's so many first generation
I think it
entrepreneurs.
was new. I don't think it's that new anymore. I mean, the first, if you look at, say, Naukri.com, those website, the .com businesses, those are what, 20, 25 years
25 years. Yeah, correct. Correct.
old. Even the second phase of startups with, say, Flipkart and Snapdeal, etc., these were what, 2007. So that's 18 years, 6, 7, 18, 19 years. So I think we have had a good 2+ decades of
Yeah.
very prominent startup activity in the country. I think it's been mainstream for at least 10 years, if not more. I think longer, maybe 15 years. It's been quite mainstream. By which I mean the concept of a startup, people understanding what it is, people, mature professionals from other industries joining these startups. This has all been, I mean, this has been going on for maybe longer than 10, 15 years. But yes, I think the financial industry has just come around to this maybe in 21, 22 with the IPOs of Nykaa, Zomato, Policy Bazaar, etc. When those came in. So for the financial institutions, probably that was the inflection point.
And I feel like newer to have unicorns, and also newer if you can compare to like the tried and tested career paths, right? Like, I mean, this is still 20, 25 years, but versus the engineers, doctors, lawyers, the traditional
I would
career
say
paths.
around maybe 2013, 12, or maybe 30, not 2014, 15 is when startups became some of the preferred recruiters at MBA schools.
Interesting.
That's a metric I use for measuring which industry has become attractive in the country as a whole, because MBA students will always go towards, because for the longest time of 70 years, MBA students were okay, consulting, investment banking.
Yeah.
That's it. And then, of course, 2005 onwards, it was tech. Your Meta, and I mean, then those days, Facebook, Google were hiring a lot of MBA. They started hiring. So I think maybe when that started, that means that it became mainstream. So that's more than 10 years, at the least.
So I was going to use that as a segue to talk about career paths and trajectories. As we wind down, a few more questions for you, Abhishek. One is, you majored in economics. You joined the media industry at a time that everyone was quite excited about the media, which is probably dating both of us at this point. For younger viewers and listeners, there was such a thing as legacy media that people were excited about. TV news was new at the time. You were there as TV was kicking off. And then at some point, you decided you don't want to be a journalist and you went to business school. Can you take us through a little bit? And the context for this is, it's sometimes interesting for people to know that, all that pressure is not required when you're 19, 20, 21. Like, you don't have to know how the rest of your life is going to pan out. I'd love to know a little bit about your thinking in terms of, okay, I'm not going to be an editorial person anymore. I'm going to actually go to business school and kick off the second half of my career.
I did economics in college, and I wanted to do my master's, but at that particular moment, I wasn't sure whether I had applied, and I think I got into some MA economics, master's in economics, but I wasn't very excited about that at that particular time. Broadcast journalism always attracted me since I started seeing people like Prannoy Roy, Dr. Roy do the elections and coverage on Doordarshan, etc. And I think NDTV had started doing the 24-hour channel for Star News in the mid to late 90s, I think. So it was interesting. It was a very exciting field. Those days there was one 24-hour news channel and one the other channel had some news, and they also became, so maybe two channels, one English, one Hindi. So it wasn't a crowded industry. It was much quieter, or not as shrill. Of course, not as shrill at all. It was a very different industry then. And I started as a business reporter, economics reporter. I covered budgets, commerce ministry, petroleum ministry. I wasn't covering markets in those days. I was covering the economy from Delhi, and all the economic ministries in Delhi, and industry bodies, etc. And so it felt like a pretty natural progression from economics to start doing budgets or covering budgets and economic policies, etc. So it wasn't it wasn't very jarring for me, except the medium. Broadcast was new. Unlike today, when everyone is making videos, those days, I don't think people understand. There were no video phones. There were no mobile phones. Okay, mobile phones. There were mobile phones, but they were super expensive.
Those huge satellite mobile phones. Yeah.
There were mobile phones in the late 90s, but it was very expensive to use one. Right. So I didn't have one. I got one much later. We used to get one from the company for shoots. When we went on shoots, we got a phone to be in touch with the office, but otherwise, and then there was no, it wasn't like where you're doing live reports all the time, because
Yeah.
live connections, VSAT connections, are very expensive.
Yeah.
There were not as many outdoor broadcast vans, OB vans. Of course, later every channel had at least dozens of OB vans. That was not the case then. The technology was such that it was a much larger vehicle, so it wasn't even very easy to take anywhere, right? So I think I started with NDTV briefly, and then moved to a couple of other channels, and then of course CNN IBN in 2005. I always say that I was lucky to be in that industry then, because in this country, because it was taking off. It was actually all of these brands that I mentioned were pioneers, right? And it was not very crowded. We were actually setting the model for a lot of channels to come after that, and like NDTV did, and like CNN IBN did, and maybe around 2005 or 6, this was around 6 or 7 years after I started working in TV, I felt that it's going in a direction where now it's becoming more personality driven, which is great, but it then meant that there was much less space for everyone else, right? And I started thinking back to when I was studying economics, and how finance and business appealed to me then. I said, now I've been an outsider in the sense that I'm covering business, but I always wanted to be an insider in terms of participating in that industry. And on a whim, I just looked around, and it was tougher for people of if you're not early 20s, to get into IIMs, because the batch was much younger. Most people they were younger, just out of engineering, and I was a certain age where I wasn't very old, but I wasn't I would have been one of the oldest people in those schools. ISB had come up, started a few years before that, and they had their USP was that they preferred people with at least 5 years of experience. So when I got into ISB and I started, I was actually just slightly above the average age. So I felt better there. I said, okay, these are my people, because they're the people who are not mid career, but at least have 5 to 10 years of experience. So there's more to connect to. There's more to learn from them. They were all from very different industries. Of course, IT was the majority, but there were doctors, there were chartered accountants, there were merchant navy, officers, army of defense officers. So of course, all this is after joining. But even before joining, I was clear that I wouldn't want to go into a school where I would be one of the oldest people, but I would want to be somewhere where there is more parity in terms of age, and also diversity in terms of background, which I felt in ISB more than IIMs. Right? IIMs
Interesting.
was what they call mostly engineering and male from top engineering colleges. So that was then, not now. Now I don't know, but those days it was mostly engineering. And so that decided my track to ISB. I was lucky enough that I was asked by the broadcast company we were working for, that I should they asked me to come back to them in a different role, and that also worked out well. That was, I think, I graduated during the economic recession. So hindsight, it worked out very well, because very soon I think the world economy was suffering. India wasn't that bad. Yeah, 2008. So anyways, I continued in the media industry, but in a very different role. And I think that was also very interesting, because there was a lot of shakeup in the industry, and otherwise in the economy across the world. And after a few years, I got this opportunity with the new venture capital fund being set up by some ex-colleagues, and started as the head of investments there. Again, we were very quiet. We did a lot of investments without much PR, and then of course, those did well. We had good number of exits, and that fund is still around, but more as a hedge fund rather than a VC fund. So I think they're still doing that. They're still doing very well. But in the process, I got in touch with some startup founders who were also angel investors, and we were co-investing in some venture, and those were the Snapdeal founders, Kunal Bahel, and he asked me to think about coming on board. Those were not early days, but I think early days of the real scale up of Snapdeal. It had already become a decent sized business, but as you recall, this is, I think, more than 10 years ago. This was just before Snapdeal with SoftBank came into India, and I was asked to head corporate development for them. Basically, all M&A after that. So did it was a very hectic time because the business was growing rapidly, and of course, it's not natural for any business to be able to grow organically like that, right? Both in terms of tech capacity, in terms of market access, etc. So we had to do a lot of M&As, and that's true of most tech companies. Largest to from if you see anywhere in the world, aggressive in acquisitions. So I think we did uh, on all sides, market access, technology acquisitions, IP acquisitions, team acquisitions. So we did the whole gamut. And as I was saying earlier, I was lucky to be part of the growth cycle, the first growth cycle of media, of broadcast TV. And I think it was only luck or timing that I was part of the tech boom, the startup boom in India, where it really took off, where it was a good time because there was not easy, but there was ample capital available to experiment, to do acquisitions, to fail, but still be alive. So we did that for some years. Then, took a break, went back to venture, and as it happens in my career, I was again approached by another company to think about taking over as the group C. This is after I spent some time running a private equity fund, and that was again back in media. So after more than 10 years, I went back to media. But this was different kind of media. This was not news. This is entertainment,
Mass media.
full-fledged Balaji Telefilms, run by Ekta, who convinced me to come on board as a group CEO. And that was, again, I think it was a great learning experience. Just when you think you're too old to learn new things, or you are force fed a lot of things. I say it was going back to media for me, but I think it was completely different. I think there is probably very little in common between the news media and the non-news media, which is entertainment, movies, of course, but even television. In television, these are two very different. They're on the same platform, but the nature of these two is very, very different. So I think it was great being there. It was a relatively new space for me in terms of wherever I worked, I've known the people in the industry, but in this case, it was relatively new. I didn't know too many people in that space. But,
So we'll have to do a full other episode on entertainment industry, I think, and movies versus OTT and versus the incredible insider stories you have from Bollywood, perhaps. But last two quick questions, just in the interest of time, Abhishek. One thing you're excited about. This is rapid fire. One thing you're excited about. One thing you're worried about in 2025.
Worried about first, what I mentioned right in the beginning. I think the uncertainty around what's happening globally is I think it's not a worry, it's a challenge probably for everyone to navigate. Because I remember in 2008, during the Great Recession, or the recession in the West, the housing bubble, all that, India wasn't very affected. I mean, we all know that whoever was around working at that time, we saw it wasn't that big an impact on India for multiple reasons. One being that, of course, we weren't as closely connected in terms of financial institutions as other countries were, and of course, our consumption, our domestic market was big enough for us. I think today, because a lot of large enterprises in India are very connected and very dependent on global trade. I think it's more worrying as to how things will settle once the whole tariff and trade war, etc., whatever, are settled in the US. And it's only the US, it's not anywhere else. So that's one. But the other, I think, the thing to look forward to is that one, I still feel we haven't seen the real impact of AI. I think what we are seeing in the impact of AI today is more in the realm of entertainment and people using GPT or Grok or whatever. I think the real, say, for example, we talked about media just now. When I was in that industry, the largest chunk of expense for many films, or most films, even in India, was CGI. Right now, with I think it's Sora and these other, even Google, is launching these. I think it was Flash, whatever. Everything from what we know as basics in multiple industries, whether it's CGI in entertainment, whether it's Adobe PDF or Photoshop in the other, all this is going to change. So I'm very excited about where things stand maybe 12 months from now, or maybe 2 years from now, because adoption is still, people have adopted it very quickly for very basic needs. But I think in depth, in terms of enterprises and people moving entire workloads onto AI. I think we haven't seen that yet. It's come in bits
Yeah.
and pieces, right? I think so. That will be interesting. I think that's very exciting.
That's something to look out for. And last question, something you're grateful for. And I have it on good authority. You are a dog father, so I suppose you should mention maybe your dog. But what are you
Yeah,
grateful for? And
that
we'll
goes
wind down with
without
this.
mentioning. I'm grateful for all the opportunities I've had. As I said earlier, it was luck, it was timing, whatever it was, but it always included someone giving that opportunity. And I think that I'm always grateful for. I think we all should be grateful for the connections we have, because it's not just networking, it's also, building relationships, which always come in handy. And I'm grateful to a lot of people in particular. To put it that way, not just opportunities, but people who have given those opportunities. And I think that's all you can say. I think what can you say more than that?
I love that. The people and the opportunities you're given, and hopefully something we can pay forward when the time comes. Abhishek, thank you so much for taking the time out despite your initial skepticism. Thanks for being on Say Again. And for those of you who've been watching or listening, thank you so much. We'd love to hear your feedback. We'll also have more information on how you can support or sponsor or be a patron as we go down through the season. Thanks so much.
Thank you.